Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello, my name is Eliza Woloson. I'm an applied anthropologist and managing director of the Human Rights Prize, Women Have Wings, based in Boulder, Colorado. Every year I've been given the privilege to do a lot of the gender panels, and this is absolutely one of the most incredible panels. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. For recording purposes, today is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. It is 2 o'clock, and this is panel number 18119, titled Empowered Voices, A New Era for Women's Rights and Gender Equality. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous people in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located in the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal of these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving the enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we give priority to students at the end of our panel for questions. So we have two producers in the audience that are in the back. If you have a question that you would like to ask of the panelists, if you could please raise your hand, and they will give you a card and a pen, and you can fill out the question, and then they'll get that card and bring it up to me. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. Just very briefly, and you can see in your schedule, there also is a pretty lengthy bio, so I'll keep my introductions of them pretty brief. And then each of them will speak for about 4 minutes, and then they'll have a cross conversation between any clarifying questions that they have of one another, and then we'll open up for questions in the audience. So our first panelist is Seanna Leath, the founder and healer and leader of the Fostering Healthy Identities and Resilience Collaborative, where she leads a diverse team of undergraduate and graduate researchers and community partners. Her research examines how cultural and ecological factors shape the positive development of Black youth and young students, young adults, with a particular emphasis on gender and racial dynamics. She's also widely published. I don't know, in her bio, she doesn't mention anything that she's published in, but she has about 20 pages of all the articles that she's written, so you'll have to look her up. It's quite impressive. She's also assistant professor of psychology and brain sciences at Washington University, St. Louis. Our second panelist is Kate Schatz. A New York Times bestselling author and queer feminist. She's the author of Rad Women book series, which includes Rad American Women A to Z, Rad Women Worldwide, Rad Girls Can, Rad American History A to Z, and the illustrated journal My Rad Life. She is a co-author of the Do the Work, an anti-racist activity book with W. Kamau Bell. Her debut novel will be published in 2026, and we don't know the title. Hopefully there's Rad in the title. If you look up her name and you look up Rad, you'll definitely find her. So we hope that there's Rad in the title. We hope she gives us the name of her next new book that she's working on. Her son Benson's also in the audience, so we'd like to give him a big shout out. He's right here. And our third panelist is Satang Nabaneh, the Director of Programs and Assistant Professor of Practice at the University of Dayton Human Rights Center. She's the co-founder of Think Young Women and Law Hub Gambia, and her work has appeared in New York Times and Africa Human Rights Law Journal and Health and Human Rights Journal, and the author of the book Choice and Conscience. Nabaneh was named one of the Africa Report's top 10 scholars to watch in 2024. And our final panelist is Rania Elmalky. She's a professor of practice in the journalism program at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and an editor at EGOB,
Yes.
a platform supporting journalists from the Middle East and Africa in publishing internationally. For 6 years, she was the editor-in-chief of the Cairo-based Daily News Egypt, then the local publishing partner of the International Herald Tribune. So we'll begin. We'll work from the outside in whenever you're ready.
Okay. Let's see. Hi, everyone. Again, I am Dr. Seanna Leath. I am a psychologist, and I work at Washington University in St. Louis, as was mentioned. I did not find out that we were doing 4-minute spiels on our work until we sat down, and so I immediately started thinking, what is it that I would want to share in relation to this topic? As mentioned, our lab looks at Black women and girls' identity development primarily within family and school contexts, and so I'm going to focus on the family piece a bit, and when I'm thinking about, current state of world affairs for gender, thinking about gender equity, and thinking about women and girls and gender-expansive folks' experiences. So I'm going to start with my daughter, okay? And she is 10 going on 11. And a couple of years ago, she received a clinical diagnosis of autism and ADHD. So my daughter's autistic. And this started a journey for us in thinking about disability, thinking about neurodivergence, thinking about, again, the erasures that happen for girls in particular related to autism and ADHD, and also thinking about as a family, how had we been supporting her and how had we been missing out on her interior life and her experiences and misunderstanding who she was and who she would be in the future, even with me being a developmental psychologist who specializes in gendered and racialized processes. And she's a Black girl, right? So there are even more missing pieces without using the actual puzzle piece thing, which is a whole thing in the autistic community, but missing out on pieces of who she was and how we could love and support her. And so I think that broadly relates to some of the work that we're doing, because a lot of times we're thinking about, women and girls' experiences, what are the conversations we still need to be having, and how do we need to expand some of the ways that we have been talking about what is available to girls. It's funny because sometimes I think we do that so much in my household that one of my sons, I have 3 boys as well, I was reading them what girls can do, because it's also good for boys to be read, books with girls as the lead person, right? And my son said, "Can boys do anything?" And I was like, maybe I'm being a little heavy-handed with some of the messaging, right? And so I also say that just to say that sometimes even when you specialize in something professionally, when it's brought home for you, right, you learn about it in new and different ways. I'm also going to mention my grandmother. So I lost my maternal grandmother a few months ago, and I think within my coping processes, I started looking into death dueling. And death duel as a practice is thinking about how we transition from this life to the next in a way similar to birth dueling, where we're bringing life into the world. And reading that book by a Nigerian author, it's actually, I think it's Briefly Perfectly Human.
I love that book so much.
It's a gorgeous book, you all, okay? So highly recommend. One, it helped me think about my grandmother's passing, and it also helped me think about it from like a broader social and community standpoint of what does it mean to be connected to others and to transition, and to think about our histories. And so I think that is one thing I'll offer too when I was thinking about, what was my grandmother's life like? What was the period that she grew up in, and how is it different from the current moment that we're living in the world that I'm raising my daughter in? Where am I situated in that? Because I am also biracial, so my grandmother is white, the one I'm talking about. And so our lived experiences related to race, ethnicity, and social class were also very different. She grew up in the Great Depression, and there are so many things that now that she's gone, I couldn't ask her about, right? And so I think that's also even interacting with the ways that I'm doing my work and thinking about the importance of also expanding to include grandmothers. I do a lot of work with adolescents and moms and thinking about the importance of intergenerational knowledge and wisdom in this moment. And then I think the last, because I don't know where I'm at with my 4 minutes, but timing for me, I try to stick with it. So it was mentioned that I have a long list of publications. It's true. Got some grant funding. I've been writing a lot because that is just what is expected, and being a psychologist and being able to make yourself legible within that disciplinary space. And yet a couple of, was it a week? Was it a month? Time is so odd right now, you all. I found out that one of my leading career grants, funding was revoked because I talk, it's gendered racism, it's disparities, it's institutional climate. And I worked on that grant for over a year, and there are not a lot of Black scholars and Black women scholars who receive that particular National Science Foundation career grant. And so that moment, as has been so many moments since, I would say, there's always something happening, is thinking about when things can be so easily snatched away, and what is left afterwards, and thinking again about the importance of community care, thinking about collectivism, thinking about having to go outside to, sometimes outside of, I'm thinking about it in terms of voting and organizing, and sometimes if voting isn't the way that we can get there, then what are the other ways that folks have been affecting change? And so I think that was a beautiful reminder of I have all these publications, but what is the impact that I'm having if I'm not also on the ground and working with women and girls in their day-to-day lives and making a meaningful and positive change? So that is what I will open and start with.
Thank you. That book, it's Dr. Alua Arthur.
So good.
Is the author.
Thank you.
Briefly, Perfectly.
I think it's
Briefly, Perfectly, something like human. Dr. Alua Arthur. It's an incredible book about being a death doula. Wow. On that note, thank you. Very well done, Dr. Leath. Okay. Good job, Seanna. My name is Kate Schatz, and thank you for having me here. It's such an honor to be in conversation. I love this conference already. It's my first time at CWA, and we've been joking that all of us panelists who've been invited here, I think everyone seems to be having the experience of we're all so impressed with each other. I keep talking to people and I'm like, I'm so excited to meet you, and they're like, wait, you're excited to meet me? I'm excited to meet you. So there's a really, and I do just think to be in a space of ideas and energy, and even when we're talking about stuff that we'd really wish that we weren't talking about, like the demise of democracy, et cetera. I think it's good to be in a space with energy and ideas, so I appreciate it. As you mentioned in your bio, I'm an author. I write, I am a storyteller. I'm always interested in storytelling and history and practical activism and combining all of those things. Sometimes I joke that I'm really the only one of my friends who's actively using her undergraduate degrees. I was a double major in women's studies and creative writing, which at the time, no one in my life thought seemed very practical. It was like, what are you going to do with that, Kate? And there you go. I write feminist books. So there you go. My best friend's a nurse. She was a political science major, right? So it doesn't matter. For the students in here, your major is not always going to translate to what you do, but I am amused at how specifically I'm using those degrees. I write in many genres, but the books that I've found the most success and also just deep satisfaction from are the books that I wrote about cool women from history. And so the first book in that series is called Rad American Women, A to Z. It's an A to Z book of cool women from American history with a focus on women who don't normally show up in history books. A is for Angela Davis. You open it up, and the first sentence you learned about her growing up in Birmingham in a neighborhood called Dynamite Hill because the KKK used to blow up the houses of black folks there. And so it's not Frog and Toad, I always say. This is not a children's book for everyone. And it goes through the alphabet, again, with a focus on women whose stories aren't told as often. So, on the cover of the book that you see a pilot. And so most people say, oh, it's Amelia Earhart. And I say, no, it's not Amelia Earhart. And it's not because she wasn't amazing. It's because she's the only woman pilot most of you have heard of. So in the book, it's actually a story about Bessie Coleman, who was the first black woman to get her international pilot's license, which she did 2 years before Amelia. And I understand that you have a nice connection to Amelia Earhart with your organization, so we can talk about Amelia. But so from that book, I wrote a book called Rad Women Worldwide about women from all over the world, and several other books, including one called Rad American History, A to Z, which is actually, as my son, who's here, I'm going to keep referencing him, when my son saw the cover of that book, he said, Mom, there's men in this book? Because it's a story of people of all genders who've come together throughout American history to make change in pursuit of justice and equity. I think in all of my books, I'm always interested in, again, and kind of feminist storytelling, shedding a light on histories that so often don't get told and are right now actually being really actively taken away and deleted and banned. My books are not banned yet because, and I always say, I think the reason my books have not been banned is because the people who are doing the book banning don't actually read books. I really believe that, and I think that if they read any of my books, they would ban them in a hot second. But they don't actually read them, and I also think it's a function of my white privilege. I walk through the world looking like this. I look nice and approachable. I don't look like someone whose work might be threatening, which makes me want to do it all the more. So not banned yet, but and I will say, to be continued. And I'm also, again, really interested in both history and storytelling and looking at all the bigger picture. But as we discussed in our panel earlier, I'm also a Virgo, and I'm very interested in practical, immediate, concrete solutions and organizing both in the sense of community organizing, but also being really organized in our approach to change making. So we can talk about some of that.
Hi, everyone. Always good to go after Kate. Super excited to be on this panel, and many thanks, Eliza, as well as our producers for curating this feminist space. Yesterday, I was talking to John, who I see in the audience. I was like, oh, there was a Manel. And Manel is a panel with all men. So, I mean, John, I take it, we have the opposite, but we do need these spaces as well. My name is Satang Nabaneh. I am a Gambian legal scholar, and I do consider myself an African feminist. I started as a child rights activist back in the Gambia, which is a small country in West Africa, surrounded on 3 sides by Senegal, with less than 3 million people. And so, within that activism space, I grew up in that space where it has always been, especially coming from traditionally patriarchal African culture and traditions, has been always this idea, how do I push back? How do I resist? Especially in terms of reinforcing the notions of motherhood and what it means to be a girl, right? And so part of what I did recently, actually, which was really cool, I have a 11-year-old son, was to write a book chapter, which was very different because given my legal background, I try not to just do legal research because it's boring. It was really around this idea of how do I raise feminist boys, right? How do I raise a feminist son? Because I do think part of the conversation as well, especially when we're thinking about empowerment, is how do we engage boys and men as well as others, in the push for women's rights. So I kind of do everything. I do a variety, especially across global contexts, on a variety of issues from reproductive rights. So as mentioned by Eliza, I have a book on conscientious objection, on choice and conscience, but also I do work around women's political participation, harmful practices, as well as numerous other topics. I am based at the University of Dayton, but quite a lot of the work that I do is also very much within a global context. And so, including, for instance, recently work focused around women and girls of African descent and how we can use international law, especially in terms of addressing, as Seanna rightly said, especially the multiple forms of discrimination that they face, right? I thought that, that is too much to do within this space, but I thought given the topic, especially a new era, and to highlight one of the work that I have been doing, is really trying to understand and analyze the sort of increasingly sophisticated machinery that we have, which we call the anti-gender movement, right? And part of that has really been in terms of engaging in ethical research. So my work, mostly collaborative work, is really at the intersection of research, education, as well as advocacy, right? So really trying to map out, for instance, the connections between conservative actors in North America, in Europe, with especially those in the global south, right? Whether that's Latin American countries, but also increasingly, as we've seen, in Africa as well. Really this idea around transnational movement of ideas, people, funding. I'm glad that we do have a journalist on the platform, so media reporting as well has really come in as well. And given that I do a potpourri of things, I have been part of groups really thinking about this concept of what we call gendered autocratization. I know it's a mouthful, it's very theoretical and abstract in that sense, right? But it is this idea, and especially as we think about this new era, around how democratic rollbacks, democratic decay, democratic backsliding, is very much connected and intertwined with the rollbacks on women's rights and the pushback on women's rights. And so part of my interest really, and part of the work that I do, especially around action research, is how do we generate the sort of evidence and the data that people that do the incredible work on the ground are able to take those forward as well. So my work has really been in terms of engaging with the UN mechanisms, but also the African human rights systems, but most especially as well is really working with communities in terms of thinking through how we learn from each other, especially given the fact that the anti-gender movement is very organized, very well funded, and I think just from our last conversation as well, is that the movement that supports women's rights is always on the reactive, right? How do we really think about being adaptive and flexible in our approaches and in our strategies as well? And I'm so much looking forward to speaking with you all, but also engaging with my fellow panelists as well. Thanks.
So now my heart is beating really fast because I'm like, I can't top that. Like, I'm just a journalist. So my name is Rania Elmalky. I came from across the world. I'm from Egypt, but I am based in Doha. I teach a graduate program in journalism. So I teach documentary, multimedia storytelling, writing, reporting, all of that. Most of my career as a journalist was spent in Egypt. I was the editor of a daily newspaper at a very sensitive time in the country. It was between 2006 and 2012 when we had the pro-democracy movement happening. I don't know if you're familiar with the uprising. Obama talked about the Egyptian kids in Tahrir Square and all of that. And obviously women were a huge part of that. I mean, we were just talking, me and Eliza, about how there was a lot of gender-based like violence and harassment committed against them to keep them out of the square, to keep them out of the forefront for the fight for the change that we were trying to achieve. And I think that was one of the most important parts of my career, covering that revolution and especially covering the stories of women and what happened after that, and how the way I see it from a journalist's perspective, a lot of things changed socially after that moment, inflection point in our modern history. So I'm not sure what everybody knows about like the history of women's movements in Egypt, but we started very early compared to the rest of the region. We're a very conservative society in general. 85% of the population is practicing Muslims. About 15% of the population are Coptic Christians, but equally conservative. Like one of the most important moments in Egyptian feminist movements was in 1923 when a very an aristocratic woman in society, her name was Hoda Sha'rawi, and she was the daughter of an Egyptian aristocrat and activist and person in government, and she decided to take off, her face veil, and that was a really important historical point. Afterwards, she set up, the Women's Association, the Egyptian Women's Association, and then went on from one thing to the next. It was all part of also the nationalist, anti-colonialist movement against British occupation. So a lot of things were going on. We got the vote in 1957, I think, as I recall, and we've had a lot of advancements, and at some point, a lot of advancements in women's issues, but other points, things were being pulled back. At this point in time, we have the biggest number of members of parliament who are women in history. So we 25% of parliament is occupied by women, which is a great thing. But it doesn't really mean that women have achieved all their rights, in my opinion. There are a lot of challenges, a lot of still the numbers are off the charts when it comes to sexual harassment on the streets. These are some of the most endemic issues. What other things really social attitudes. I mean, when we talk about women in Egypt, we have maybe more women going to university and graduating, but we only occupy 26% of the workforce. So we are underrepresented in the workforce. So there are all these challenges, obviously, but the good story, I think, in my opinion, is that the way I see it, because of technology and social media, I know a lot of people have mixed feelings about that, but the capacity to use social media has empowered a lot of women, to take matters into their own hands and start, their own movements and start their own ways of, naming and shaming harassers who are well known, for instance, in society. And a lot of also the creative arts are tackling women's issues. Recently, over the past few years, we've had TV shows, for example, that have helped change legislation, right? So there's a lot of activity happening. We're not where we should be, but I think we're getting there. So that's what I have to say for now.
So while we're waiting for questions to come in from the audience, there are a couple themes that I'm hearing from the panelists. This idea of storytelling, of history, of ancestors, about the importance of bringing those stories forward, and then also hearing about this idea of pushback. I'd like for all of you to speak a little bit about where you see this feminist movement today. I have so many questions, but that's kind of a bigger one. Maybe before we answer that question, maybe we could talk amongst yourself if you had any clarifying questions for one another.
I think it was really interesting what you were saying, Satang, about the anti-feminist movement. I mean, the word feminist, and this can be very controversial, it doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, right? Obviously, it's not a one-size-fits-all. And I mean, for the longest time, to be honest, I didn't call myself a feminist. I wouldn't say I'm a feminist. I wouldn't go out and, put why? I mean, I didn't, maybe for me, for my personal story, I grew up in quite a conservative home, but my parents were very strange, they sent us to boarding school, me and my older sister, when we were 5, in another country. So they lived in a different country. They sent us to boarding school. And when we were 15 and 16, they sent us to another country to go to university. We went to university really, really young. And we never felt that we were missing anything. We just did everything. And despite that, they were conservative. We were raised, practicing Muslims, all of that. So yeah, this whole anti-fem. Now I'm feeling it. Now I must say I'm a feminist. Growing up, I didn't feel that. right? So I thought that was really interesting, and I'd love to know why, like, how you're seeing that, and everyone else, to be honest.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think, true, as you rightly said, folks don't, they can aspire or subscribe to the values of what feminism is and what feminist values are, not necessarily calling that. I mean, examples have been given about our grandparents, our mothers, and these are folks that were able to take decisions that were radical decisions without actually putting the name feminist to their actions, right? But also in some ways as well, we do, facial expressions like rolling your eyes, right? I do think that's a feminist act, right? I roll in as a feminist act, right? But I think for me, and as somebody that grew up within the African context, but also was very much exposed at a young age as well. I think for me, it was really seeing the examples of what women leaders were able to do, right, and be both within the continent and beyond as well. And as I did introduce myself, I do introduce myself as an African feminist because I do think that that is important to me, both in terms of, acknowledging obviously that, the ideas, and I've done this critique with my PhD, so I'm not gonna bore you, right? In terms of the different types of feminism, and feminism that's really centered on the Western gaze, right? But also that doesn't really speak to the experiences of diverse communities as well. And so really part of, especially connecting it back to the idea around history and culture and ways of indigenous knowledge production is really also owing that language, right? Whilst obviously, accepting that there are critiques to all types of feminism, whatever that is, right? But also obviously acknowledging that we can draw best examples whilst contextualizing what that means, right? And so part of my work, even at the African regional level, has really been how do we take international instruments like CEDAW, right, and contextualize it within Africa, right? So things like harmful practices, female genital mutilation, and others that might not necessarily interest somebody within the Western context, right, will obviously be something that speaks to the specific needs of African women and girls. So I approach it that way, but also obviously acknowledging that as well. But I do think the times does require that we take a stance, that we put a name to it, because it is even naming yourself as a feminist is a political action. Yeah.
Oh, I absolutely agree, and I always put feminist in my bio, and for a similar reason, and it's something I've been calling myself a feminist since I was very young, and it has always felt like a strong statement. It never felt like something that was particularly cool. It always felt like a little bit of a middle finger to the people that were around me, and I think I came to it as a young person kind of through punk rock and through a lot of kind of like feminist music of the 90s. But I feel so grateful. I feel just really grateful for getting the chance very early in my undergraduate education. I mentioned that I was a women's studies major, and that was really transformative for me because from a very early age, I got a very thorough grounding in the history of feminism and of Black feminism, of global feminism, and I was able to, from a very young age, to understand what white feminism is, what Western feminism was, what the limits of my knowledge and understanding, and I had that intersectional understanding of it very early, and I feel I'm like always very grateful to the professors I got to work with, who gave me Angela Davis to read, and I understood how these intersections of identity work together. And I think that, to bring it back to what you were talking about with our current backlash, right? And I think I strongly believe in the importance of naming and understanding our identities and our intersecting identities, right? I mean, we know the personal is political, and as women, we are political. Our identity, our existence is political, whether we like it or not. And so when we see these attacks on DEI, when we see the word woman being stripped from, grants being denied because of that, when it's getting deleted from websites, again, that is what we do this work for. So I keep the word feminist in my bio.
Now it's my turn. No, I'm just joking, because we're heading down, we're going down the line, and also trying to pull in things from what others were saying. A couple of things. I'm also note taking on my phone, so I can't remember when it was, but I think it was an interview that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, and I think she was asked like when she would be satisfied with how many women would sit on the Supreme Court, and I think she said when it's all 12. Is it 12? I'm like, listen, this is also the problem in our current moment, right? Because I'm like, is it 12 or 6? And and I'm a whole professor. And I'm like, I don't know. What is the number? And I think, she got backlash for that. But she said, but it's been 12 men all these years. And so what is your concern if the Supreme Court was all 12 women? And we know now we're moving away from that a bit. But the sentiment is there. And I think the importance of reframing and really taking it seriously when we kind of have a negative reaction or response to notions of gender equity and or gender liberation for gender expansive folks, for women and girls. And when we're thinking about, do I label myself as a feminist, or how do I think about those types of things? I'm also, and you're talking about Black feminism, brought into conversation with womanism, which Alice Walker kind of coined, and talking about how Black women and other Indigenous and women of color were left out of kind of first wave feminism. Yeah. And so always thinking again about history, how we've been moving forward. And I think a lot of my work is thinking about what does it mean to live well and live authentically. And I think that within that, for women and girls, it requires resistance in some ways. But then there's a piece of it for me where I'm like, to live out your existence in resistance is exhausting. And so when we're thinking about notions of wellness and liberation and freedom, a piece of it for me is also when I'm talking with women and girls or talking with their families, it's like, how are you, are you okay? And what would you need to be okay in your daily life, and then also socially and structurally to make those things happen? And we're in this moment where structurally and socially, a lot of things are being designed, taken back, broken down to make sure that those who are most marginalized in our society, in fact, cannot be well. Let me see, there was one more little piece. Okay, yeah, that is important. I'm glad that I went up to the top of my little phone screen, because part of it for me too in this work is this notion of bringing men and boys in. So there's a paper that we published talking about colorism. And colorism is, skin tone, privileges for lighter toned skin or white women, for instance, compared to darker skinned Black women. And one of the things that we talked about, we were talking about it with Black girls in schools. And we said the importance of bringing Black boys and Black men into conversations on colorism, because a lot of time we're assuming, we just need to focus on the self-esteem or the body image issues among girls and women, right? But no, we also need to think about how colorism is perpetuated by everyone in society, and the importance of also calling folks into these conversations versus calling out or making it seem like there's an us or them type of mentality around any particular social issue. And I think that applies, we've seen it, around reproductive health and reproductive justice, thinking about the types of books we're creating and we're reading, just in general, seeing how is my life connected to other people's lives and their issues, and where within that can I show care and demonstrate that we are in fact connected, even as we have different social positions.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. So there's so many wonderful questions.
I know, I've been watching them all get brought up to you, and I'm
that's
they're
a lot really of good. They're so good. So I've consolidated a number of them, and
do they all boil down to what is happening?
What is going on? That's the gist of them all. But one theme that I'm seeing come forward, and it's something that we haven't, and none of us, I don't believe we've addressed this idea of trans people. What is the future for LGBTQ and trans people, and where does trans women fit into this conversation of feminism?
Great.
Any thoughts?
Let me just state really unequivocally that trans women are women, and that trans people are human beings, and that they deserve the rights. They deserve the right. And also, I think I've just been kind of obsessed with how the degree to which I think we have to state the painfully obvious. And I would also just like to say that trans people exist, period, full stop. You can delete people from your websites, but they exist, and they deserve dignity, and they deserve respect. And again, you kind of mentioned backlash, and I just think it's so important right now for those of us who are on what I like to call the right side of history, the correct side of this moment, to not get gaslit into thinking that we asked for too much, right? Or that we did too much. And I think there's this kind of conversation on the left and in the media around, that this backlash that we're experiencing right now, these attacks on all of this is somehow our fault, right? We talk too much about trans people. We talk too much about our rights, right? We've asked for too much. And any chance that there's a microphone in front of me these days, I want to talk about that because I think that it's so dangerous. It's psychically dangerous, it's ethically dangerous, and it's also just wrong. This is not, we did not do anything wrong by continuing to advocate for people's basic dignity and rights. And I think that if we get distracted by that and start to worry that, oh, well, we shouldn't have brought this up, and oh, no, absolutely not. So that's my statement.
I think I just wanted to chime in on the question because I do think part of that, what that calls on us as well, right, is even in terms of how do we do organizing, right? And so part of my research and engagement has really been this idea, and I mean, we already obviously spotlighted the idea around intersectionality, right? But what does it mean to do intersectional organizing? Because the reality is, especially when you talk about trans, right, women and so forth, is that what we've seen, especially with the work that I do at the global level, is that the movements are also very siloed, right? The women's movement is separate from the sexual minority movement to, the folks that are, engaged in other issues as well. And so part of what we've also been able to uncover as well, right, is that the anti-rights movement, the anti-gender movement, right, really is not just targeting folks that are doing reproductive rights or abortion issues, right? They target everybody, right, so long as you're dealing with marginalized communities. And so what that also calls on the feminist movement as well, right? And we know that there are obviously divisions and critiques and contested notions of what we should focus on or not. But I do think, especially given the current context that we're in, that in order to move forward and address some of the challenges that we're facing and will face more, is really to organize across issues and movements and not to do siloed ways of what we usually have done in the past as well.
I'm going to briefly chime in. One of my students is finishing their dissertation, and it's on Black queer youth and young adults and family support networks, and it's talking about integrating how we think about family for chosen family as well as family of origin. And I say that to say because they are doing a beautiful job, and they are also queer, and they talk to trans folks themselves. So my first and foremost piece is always, I do a lot of listening around this conversation, echoing everything that Kate said. But in some of the conversations as well that I have with folks when they're concerned about sports and they're concerned about bathrooms, is parroting it back and asking them, what exactly are you afraid of? What does denying gender affirmation, gender affirming care, denying medication, denying personhood, what does that do for you? Because at the root of this is what is happening. And I think a lot of times the fears are not actually based in realities, like the bathroom conversation, where I'm you're actually more likely to be attacked by a cisgender man than by a trans woman trying to use the bathroom. And so let's actually talk about what conversations are we having here. And going back to even the point about organizing, we have to be able to talk through these things, especially with folks who have differences of opinions. Mm-hmm. And that is especially important when our difference of opinion is based on my personhood, right? And so I think this is something where for me, I'm this is a tedious conversation. Why do we keep having to have some of these conversations? But also now I can't even access abortion. So something that we thought was settled is in fact not settled whatsoever, right? And so I think it is important to consider what does it mean to communicate across difference, be able to engage in these dialogues. And I think a lot, some of these issues are coming down to people being afraid. Yeah.
I just want to say that I'm sorry I can't comment on this because it's not a big issue where I'm from, but we have other issues that are related to just women being women and being allowed to just live the way they want in my country, at least in Egypt. I mean, you would not imagine that only in the past maybe 10 years are women being allowed to or forcing society to accept moving out of your parents' home when you're 30 years old to live on your own. This is something unthinkable. Until just a few years ago, when I started seeing things younger women going out, living on their own, renting an apartment, and I've seen, you know, film after film and story after story that we've covered about how hard it is, for example, to rent an apartment, just as a woman. You know what I mean? So things like that, I mean, these are really the issues that are women struggling with, like sexual harassment, things like you know, the getting divorced, for example, getting a divorce, and how difficult that was until maybe just 10 or 15 years ago when a law was changed that would allow women to, you know, without having to show fault in the husband, to just get divorced. You know, things like that are occupying the conversation around women in Egypt. Yeah.
Can I also say, and perhaps to Rania, but also to the panelists as well. I mean, you know, when we think about pushback and backlash now as well, right, it's the silencing of feminist voices, right? And I do wonder, especially in, you know, in democratic transitions and post-conflict context, right, where we've seen obviously in the Arab Spring with women taking leadership, but very recently as well, women taking leadership in Sudan, right, which led to the change of government. I mean, we know that Sudan right now is facing one of a major humanitarian crisis, but I think what is also interesting as well even is during those times of transition, right, that women's voices are also silent. We saw that in Sudan, right, where, you know, they were at the forefront in the streets, right, and then when the new government came in, it was a whole totally different story. It's like, go back home, right? And I think it's not just about, even in those instances, that's like protest, but we've seen that even in the Gambia, right? So the Gambia was under a dictatorship for 22 years. We, you know, transition or are transitioning into a democratic state. And one of the interesting things about that is, you know, when we're transitioning, right, to a democracy, you think things are supposed to be wonderful and good, right? But then it is also usually also an opportunity as well, even with the anti-rights movement, but also especially folks that want to reinforce patriarchal notions of what it means to be a woman, right? Really using that opportunity, that democratic opportunity for pushback. So we saw, for instance, the Gambia last year being the first country in the world that tried to decriminalize female genital mutilation, right? I mean, it's crazy even thinking about that. Yeah, the opposite.
The opposite.
The opposite. So it's
we
not,
criminalized it, but it's still happening. But
right.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, in the Gambia, it was
Yeah.
criminalized since 2015, and then out of the blue, because there is then a transition, and everybody has a voice, freedom of speech and religion and all of that. Then it's like, yeah, let's bring it back. And I do think it's problematic as well, especially as we think about how women and girls, as well as gender diverse persons, usually take the opportunity, especially in transition, to lead the process, to lead the collective action. But then when those positive changes come on board, that is also usually an opportunity that rights are also rolled back. And so calls, I guess, on us as well, especially in terms of sustained ways of organizing and collective action as well.
Thank you. Okay, this next question, and some of you addressed it, talked a little bit about this. Gender inequality has existed for so many thousands of years that we've become blind to it. How do we help people see with new eyes so we can end the oldest type of oppression impacting half the world?
I don't feel blind to it. I notice it all the time, every day. I know what the person means, but.
I think, whilst people are thinking, I think one of the ways of doing that as well, I really think, is also centering the voices of those that have been impacted in various ways around inequality, because we do know that, privilege is not just about, your skin color, right? But obviously we're here, partly our education and other things, right? But it is really women, who, as you rightly said, indicated in your books, but also others who've not really had the platform to share their stories as well, I think is really using that opportunity to center and amplify and elevate the voices and the lived experiences of women and girls who undergo these inequalities as well. And so I think it's giving a face to the story, because I mean, the numbers are great. Statistics is good. I'm not a statistic person, I'm a legal person, so numbers are boring. But I do think how we engage with, especially as we think about research, right? And you have a lot of quote-unquote academics on, in the panel as well, academics. But I do think everybody on the panel as well is scholar activists. So I think that also comes with responsibilities as well, even as we think about research, right? So it's not, I mean, yes, to her point, to Sina's point earlier, we have to do the books, we have to do the journal articles, because that's the traditional mode of what it means to be faculty, right? But I also think increasingly as well is what we call community engaged research or action research. How do we do research with communities and not on communities, but also ensuring that the research that we do is not just abstract or just for academic purposes, but that we're able to sort of use it as a way to support. I know some people don't really like the word empowered. I mean, there's a whole debate about whether we should be using empowered still or not. But anyway, I guess that's not for the panel. But really in terms of how do we work collaboratively with affected communities, especially in terms of thinking about amplifying their stories, their narratives, but also using and leveraging the resources that higher ed has, academia, in order to sort of support the incredible work that's usually been done by folks on the ground.
I mean, from my perspective as a journalist, I think representation. I mean, just showing women all the time, everywhere, including women in everything that is done in society. Like in Egypt, this is really, as I said before, like in the past few years, there's been such a huge focus on just, like narrative TV series that are either made by women completely or are about women or are focused on women's issues. And so I think it's really, really important to, to have that all the time. And even if, we have also the whole influencers on social media, and they're also very, very important because they show younger women, younger generations that they can be present, they can be out there, do whatever they want, that they have the freedom now to just kind of be in the media without being officially, selected and and placed on a screen, right? You can just do what you want to do, and I think representation is really, really important. I think we should, like as journalists, we need to focus on women's stories from all the different, areas of which the country. I mean, in Egypt, for example, there's a lot of focus on cities, not enough focus on rural areas. And I think this is it's a big gap that needs to be fixed. But I think that's a really important thing to focus on. Yeah.
I wanted to add in. I can't believe 50 minutes has passed already. Okay, so there is this, and I might be saying her name wrong, but it's called a social change wheel by Deepa Iyer. Okay. And I love the social change wheel because it has all of these different roles, right? For instance, there are weavers, experimenters, frontline responders, visionaries, caregivers, disruptors, give a couple more, storytellers and healers. And something that I'm hearing across some of our responses is this notion that like we all have a role to play, and two, our roles do not have to be the same. And where can you find yourself within whatever the social change, the issue is that you really care about, and that you think that you have strengths, that you think I can be impactful in this way. I think in thinking about even on the social change wheel, one of the things that I really liked is that caregiving is one of them. So thinking about the roles that in many ways women and girls have been relegated to, also amplifying that, thinking about, where might we have not considered ourselves notions of disruptors or visionaries when we know that is not the case. Going back to something Satang was saying earlier about eye rolls being resistance. And so there's a piece of it for me where you asked, what do we do to where we can get rid of or eradicate this like millennial long tradition. I wanted to go off on a tangent where I'm like, I think oppression is just part of the human condition. I think we just create hierarchies out of anything we can create hierarchies out of. But in the meantime, the other part, like a part of it for me too in my research is thinking about like daily resistance are things like eye rolls, and also not missing out on the fact that like women and girls have been out here living joyful lives and finding ways to be like, I'm okay to what you say I can't do, we still find ways to do it and show up for one another and not losing sight of that as well. But yeah, the social change wheel is always helpful for me because I was like, you know what, I'm a storyteller. I'd probably be a caregiver. I like building and like building between people, and I'm good at bridging relationships. So maybe that's what's my important role, and I'm not gonna be on social media, maybe be an influencer in that way, but I still have something important to offer.
Yeah, I think that's such an important reminder to people, and I talk about that a lot, just that we all, like, it's get in where you fit in, right? Everybody has a different skill set, and, and when it comes to kind of activism and change making, right? Some people want to be on the front lines in the streets leading the protests, and some people are introverts and they feel safer at home, and they're going to go home and they're knitting blankets for unhoused people, and that's their work, right? We all have a different kind of way of plugging in and showing up, and I think that identifying where you are in that, I love that the wheel of change is so important. I do want to quickly plug back to this question of how do we end millennia of oppression, but the importance of getting women into positions of power, because when we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about power and control, and so obviously a lot of us worked really hard to make that happen in November, and that did not, but that's not the only election out there, and it's not just about electoral politics, right? But women in positions of power across the board, right? That's in your local community, that's in your workplace, that's in churches, that's in nonprofits, that's in all kinds of spaces. What happens when we work to elevate women into positions of power and leadership, right? It can be transformative. It's not always great, right? Not all women leaders are great, right? Let's be really clear about that. But and also, so to those of you who are like, oh, I love that, but like, I'm never going to run for office, right? This is another, like, there's rules for you too, right? You can work on campaigns. You can find out who's running in your local elections, right? You can support and encourage others. And also investing in organizations that are training those next generations of young women leaders. There's so many great organizations out there. And I think, again, if that feels like your thing you want to work on, like there's organizations like Emerge and other organizations that are, really working to train and empower those young women who we are really going to need.
Can I also say as well, especially just on the last point, because that has been sort of my life's work in some ways. Now I sound so old. When Eliza was introducing me, she talked about Think Young Women, which I co-founded back in the Gambia in 2010. And for me, part of that is really how do we empower the next generation of female leaders, right? Because I do think that is so important and so vital, right? Eliza and I spent almost an hour just talking about the amazing things that young people are doing, particularly young women in the US, but also globally as well, right? How do we amplify that? How do we provide the sort of mentorship support, right? So through that organization, for example, we have the Girls Mentorship Program, which really tries to, year-long round, to really, empower these young girls that are in elementary school, in high school, connect them with people, especially other women leaders, because representation, as you said, really matters, right? If they see a woman CEO, a woman politician, they can aspire to be that. And so thinking about how we also really invest in the young girls that are in and outside of school, and how we support mentorship, because I do think it's an important aspect as we move, through this era into possibly a better one.
And we know, I'm just going to add real quick, that there's these statistics around that women statistically need to be asked or encouraged to run for office, right? Where men are just like, oh, I'd be great at this, like, right? So, and there's some specific data about that, about like how many times most women who are running for office had to be like encouraged. So just thinking of that as like a thing you could do, like if there are young people or there are women in your life of any age who you think would be great, how far that can go. Just telling someone you would be an amazing like city council person. Like, have you ever thought about that? And it really, like most women will just like, I don't know, I'm too busy, right? And the importance of just seeing someone and identifying that in them, I think can go such a long way.
Okay, this is going to be our final question, and it's a good one. I know. This is going to be a good one, though. And because I'm getting my pen is poised, ready to take notes here.
Oh,
What are trusted sources? This is for probably Rania. It's for everyone.
Okay.
Trusted sources for feminist stories / movements.
All of us are like,
the rad, maybe the rad collection.
oh yeah, thank you. They're right out there at the table.
It's right there.
For sale out there at the table.
Oh, someone else go. I have to think about this for a minute.
I'm making a list. Hold on. I need a second. I'm
I
like,
know.
typing.
This is like when someone asks me, like, what's your favorite novel? And then I'm just like,
Oh God, there are too many.
You know, I will start by saying, and this is maybe not the answer this person had in mind, but to go back to the beginning when you talked about your grandmother stories and that she's not with us anymore and that think you can't ask her. I, as a researcher, I'm such a nerd for archives and for oral histories. And I think that, and I do a lot of research with, and for my next book, I'm doing a lot of research that is involving like archives of like lesbian life in past decades. And there's a lot out there. There's a lot of oral history. There's a lot of storytelling. And I think to go to your point about centering those voices that maybe aren't the ones that are up on the panels, that is a place that we can go and really actually just talking to people, especially our elders, about their experiences. I know that's not like a great source for like explaining what is happening in the world. So hopefully we can come up with some good journalism answers as well. But I think that's a really good place to think about because I think it's incredibly reliable. I will also say I really enjoy the Substack platform. I actually don't use social media anymore. I don't use Instagram. I don't use Facebook. I stopped using all of that. But I really enjoy Substack. And there's a number of really great journalists, independent journalists who use that platform who are no longer at larger publications or who are just using that. And I can look it up and tell people afterwards who the people are that I really like to follow.
So there is something to this question. I'm going to answer it for me. If I'm thinking about trusted sources, right, and I'm thinking about some of the folks, going back to you mentioned Angela Davis earlier on. I'm a Black feminist scholar, so I'm reading Bell Hooks, I'm reading Audre Lorde, I'm reading Brittany Cooper, I'm reading Angela Davis, Zora Neale Hurston, Marsha P. Johnson, Cole Arthur Riley with her Black liturgies. And I think I say this because depending on, one, I read widely, so I would say like read all sorts of folks. There are trusted sources in all sorts of ways. There are the girls in your life. There are trans folks telling you about their experiences. There are disabled girls and women telling you about their experiences. Those are trusted sources. For me, when I'm wanting to know about Black women and girls' experiences, I'm also looking at like Chimamanda Adichie, right? And I'm reading like those trusted sources for me around a particular issue is where I would go. So think about it. Who do you want to hear from? And most likely there are women or girls or other folks writing about those issues or those topics, even if it's harder to in fact find them. So I can't think of one particular book, but I can think of many sources. And I'm not also going to only list news sources versus like poetry books, spoken word, again, going back to oral histories and archives. So that would be my answer.
Brittany Cooper is one of my favorite people to listen to and read right now.
I would fangirl Eloquent Rage, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Brittany Cooper is brilliant.
I still trust Democracy Now!, I want to say. I will always trust and listen to Amy Goodman.
I mean, from my part of the world, I mean, there are obviously lots of novelists. One of them, the ones I love the most is Miral al-Tahawi. She's a novelist. She often deals with women's issues. There's also Radwa Ashur. There's also, I mean, there are just so many. There's actually a scholar and an activist who was world famous and who passed away just a few years ago. Her name was Nawal As-Saadawi. And she just made so many changes in society. Like she was the first one in Egypt to talk about FGM, and based on her work, and like she was a physician, she was a doctor, and also a women's advocate. And her life story itself is incredible. So yeah, there's just so much. I think. Yeah.
I think the takeaway from this conversation is decolonize your reading list.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the summary.
Yeah, I think it's really important to read the experiences of women, I mean, everywhere, because we learn from each other.
Are any of you familiar with a online platform called World Pulse? Or is anybody else out here? It's called World Pulse. But I just have to mention it because it is a platform that allows civil society women to converse with one another. It's been around for about 20 20 years maybe. But I'm just mentioning it, that you might want to look it up. I think it's an interesting one.
And I'd like to add that I feel like maybe there's something implicit in that question, or at least that my ears are picking up on, is the idea of a trusted source. And I just want to remind everyone that, I think especially as we have conversations around like fake news and AI and like what's real and what can we trust, you're smart. And don't forget that you can rely on your own intelligence to discern what's real and what's not. We all need, I think, a really, really heightened BS detector. I guess we don't really swear here at CWA. So, and you probably already have a pretty good one. And I think that, I think that we get really anxious, and it's easy to get anxious about misinformation, and I share that. But you have good instincts, and I think that you can know how to double check, triple check sources, and I do that all the time. When I see a new website or an article, like I will still go and Google this person and who are they. I make sure they're real, and so don't forget that you have good instincts.
I think we probably have time for one quick question, and this is a nice closer. How can we come together for collective action? There was a number of questions about that. So maybe just 2 minutes or so, or a minute of each of you, and then you could have a minute to say anything you'd like to say.
I have an answer for that. Well, you're all here right now, collectively. You are in a room with other people who chose to come here, which indicates that you all probably have, at least to some degree, a shared interest in this topic and these issues, and you're likely all relatively local. So I want to challenge everybody to make a new friend when we're done. And I want to make it clear, this is not my idea. My friend Kamau that I write books with, he did this at an event recently where similarly some people were like, how do we build community? And he was like, look around, this is your community. Make a new friend after this. Go up to someone, say, what did you think? What brought you here? Right? I don't know, maybe you all know each other. I don't know. But talk to the people that are in these spaces with you. That is how you build community, by actually talking to the people that are right there, shared interests, and you never know what might come of that.
Okay, I have to go after this one, only because I recently did one of those light up the night 5Ks around like sexual harassment and women being able to like walk at night and in public. And at the beginning they said, oftentimes men are asking me, what can I do? And they were like, so during this run, tap a woman next to you and ask her, what is your role? And I was like, do not tap me on this 5K, you strange man. Like, this is terrible advice, in fact. But it was the first one. They're going to work on that messaging. Like, that's okay. But I had to go there. I was like, please don't tap me. But what I would actually say, I think around collective action, we have to get much better at repair. I think a lot of the issues come down to divisive politics. It comes down to harm being wrought against different communities. And I think within Western culture, but also more broadly, in general, I think humans can be very punitive and can be very hurtful towards one another, especially if you consider yourself on a different side of an issue. Yeah. And I think we are not good as like broad human community in doing repair work and doing accountability that does not involve like an eye for an eye. So if I'm thinking about collective action and I'm thinking about organizing and what it really looks like to do more transformational change, I think we have to work on like, what does it mean? There's this beautiful book about childhood sexual assault, about love with accountability, and that's kind of the centering question, because like childhood sexual assault, rape, pedophilia, those are issues where folks are like, those folks, throw them into the jail, kill them, like, death penalty. And it's like some of those issues, those hot button issues, even then, what does it look like to repair those relationships and hold people accountable that does not ostracize them from society writ large? And so that's what I would say.
Can I go? Because I don't want to go for last. I'll just say my little thing, and I'm just gonna disappear. All right. So, like, I think it's very important also to accept our differences as women, right? From whichever part of the world we're in, because we do have differences. I mean, we can't just go around, thinking that everyone needs to agree with everyone so that we can have common ground to make change. Right, I think that's where we need to start, and for diehard feminists to adopt big issues that are happening around the world that are targeting women, like for example in Gaza, 70% of the people who were killed in that war have been women and children, and there has been a huge kind of backlash against against feminists in the Western world who have not spoken up enough about that. So I think it's really important to recognize the humanity, the shared humanity, and to accept that we come from different places, we have different priorities, but we can still support each other. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and going last means I don't have anything else to say. I think what, part of the takeaway as well, especially, and I did this with the last session, I'm going to do it because I work from a global perspective, is just also a heightened, as we engage in collective action, also a heightened awareness of the global dynamics of the era that we are in, but also the problems in our backyard being very similar and mirroring what we have in other spaces as well. And perhaps something that was mentioned here about joy and so forth, right? I think it's also really centered in joy and love as justice. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
That was a great conclusion.
Thank you.
Beautiful.